This is the red line. The year is 1947. The Second World War has come to an end, and the stage is being set for what would become known as the Cold War. The Allies and the Soviets have begun dividing up a decimated Europe. The Iron Curtain, as it would come to be known, is beginning to take shape and form a divide many people wouldn't cross again for nearly 50 years. When the chips began to fall, most countries were already firmly ideologically entrenched on one side of the Iron Curtain or the other, with countries like France, Belgium, the United Kingdom and the Netherlands looking firmly to the west, and countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria aligning themselves eastwards with Moscow. What wasn't so certain though was where some of the other countries like Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia and Turkey might sit in the new divides of Europe. Both Washington and Moscow knew that winning the favour of these nations at this critical moment in time would seal their fate for years to come, and the moves the US made back then to win over Italy, Greece and Turkey still bear fruit today, with all three of these nations still being important members of NATO today. Even now, we see huge cultural and economic differences between the countries from either side of the Iron Curtain, with the average GDP being much higher even today with the countries that were won over by the West. I bring this up because this exact situation seems to be playing out once again, but not in Europe this time. This time it's taking place in Asia, all around the Indo-Pacific. Once again, we're seeing a rising competition between two superpowers, Washington and Beijing, with the Asia-Pacific already starting to be divided up much like Europe 70 years beforehand, with countries like Laos, Cambodia, Pakistan, Myanmar and North Korea closely aligning with Beijing, whereas South Korea, India, Australia, Japan and Taiwan are closely tying themselves with Washington. But much like 1947, there are a few countries still yet to fully make that decision, a decision which will shape not only their country's economic future, but also the balance of power in Asia. These are countries like Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines and Bangladesh. But the most important of these, and the one that will likely hold the balance of power for Asia, is without a doubt Indonesia. Indonesia is an incredibly large country, with over 17,000 islands stretched over a distance equal to London to Kabul. Their population is growing incredibly rapidly as well, set to hit 325 million by the year 2045. And by all accounts, Indonesia's economy will also take the number 4 slot by that same year. Yet, for a country so large and with so much potential, the US has very little to do with them, with Indonesia well below small nations like Singapore and Ireland for trade with the US. For a country so important, America has not made the appropriate outreach. Indonesia has an already incredibly quickly growing economy, but even with this economic potential, there is still a lot of problems to be contended with domestically before Indonesia can take its role as a world power. For one, the country has some of the most stark levels of income inequality, with residents in upper class areas of Jakarta in high rises and being the highest per capita users of Twitter anywhere on the planet, whereas other parts of the east of the country don't even have electricity yet. To compound the issue, the internal logistics in some parts of Indonesia are so ragged that in many cases it is cheaper and quicker to order a package all the way from the United Kingdom to one of these islands than it would be to receive one from another remote Indonesian island. But these issues are starting to get fixed, and the sleeping giant that is Indonesia is beginning to wake up. To prepare for this awakening, Beijing has already been making a lot of investments into Indonesia to sow seeds for a long-term relationship and a nation-to-nation partnership. But the relationship between Jakarta and Beijing is starting to lose a lot of its shine because of the dispute over the islands in the South China Sea. The map China uses to make all their claims over the South China Sea is called the 9-dash line, based on a somewhat dubious ancient Chinese map. But this part here particularly lays claim to a bunch of small Indonesian islands. Jakarta and Beijing had both just ignored this issue for a long time, trying not to let it derail a flowering relationship. But recently, Chinese fishing boats have begun showing up in Indonesian waters and probing the outer perimeters of Jakarta's defences, and Indonesia is not at all happy with this. But China has no other choice. Either you follow the 9-dash line or you don't. The Indonesians, having seen how this played out in places like the Philippines, have begun fortifying their outer islands, staging large military exercises, and showing China that they will be taking the border island's integrity very seriously. The Indonesian army is nothing to laugh at either, with just under 400,000 active military personnel and a quickly expanding navy. For years, this army was more geared towards quashing internal uprisings and securing far-flung islands, as well as patrolling internal waterways, but this is starting to change, and the Indonesian army is rapidly starting to become one of the most impressive forces in the region. So for now, China is somewhat backing off, and going back to economic means of influence when it comes to Jakarta, knowing that if Jakarta were to ever become a full-blown enemy of Beijing, it would make any naval move south out of the South China Sea very difficult for China. So much like we saw in the late 1940s, an opening has appeared. A once-in-a-generation chance for the US to build close ties with Jakarta and anchor themselves in Southeast Asia, the outer perimeters of China. Because as we saw at the start of the Cold War, decisions and friendships made now may be incredibly important for decades to come. We did an entire piece on the geopolitics of Indonesia with Kyle Springer, Natalie Sambhi, and Gordon Flake, talking about everything from the Japanese occupation to the country's breakaway states. And if you want to hear more about that, you can click here.